The story of Joseph prepares us for the book of Exodus. Now, there's so much we could say about Joseph, but in this video, we're looking at family conflict and how history repeats itself. So, let's dive in. The story of Joseph is different to the others we've read thus far in Genesis. It gives us a very different picture of how God works in our lives and in the world. Now, prior to the Joseph story, God's presence was very evident, very direct. For example, in the story of Noah, Noah obeys God and builds an ark and loads it up with animals. Then God sends continual rain on earth for 40 days, after which he stops it, and everyone in the ark is saved. Further along, Abraham and Sarah miraculously conceive a child when they're way past it. And then God tells Abraham to offer up his son, Isaac. And Abraham is obediently about to do so when God miraculously intervenes. Jacob has a vision of angels going up and down a ladder between heaven and earth. And then comes the story of Joseph, which concludes the book of Genesis. Then in Exodus, God raises up Moses and Aaron as his spokesman and sends devastating plagues on Egypt to bring the Pharaoh to his knees. God piles up the waters of the Red Sea so the Israelites can pass through, and then brings the waters crashing down on the Egyptian army. What we see is that prior to the story of Joseph, God is a miraculous, intervening God whose power is on full display. And again, after the story of Joseph, we see God's miraculous power very evident. The only real choice people have is either get with God's program or resist his power and suffer the consequences. It's about a dysfunctional family where emotions boil over. And as these family dynamics come to a head, we see human nature at its worst, with each person choosing how they will act toward the other. And throughout it all, as far as this family is concerned, the name of God is not mentioned. Apart from Joseph's dreams, God speaks to no one. On the surface, he doesn't intervene. He sort of lets them almost maul each other to death. Do you remember a song years ago by Cliff Richard called From a Distance? God is watching from a distance. Well, that's very bad theology, because even though God seems to be distant, he is there. But on the surface, it appears to be all about human interactions, causing events to unfold in quite a messy way, with Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery. In the end, however, Joseph acknowledges that the hand of God has been at work all along. God has placed him in a position of power in Egypt for his purposes. And yet, there's always been the possibility that Joseph wouldn't get that God was in it, and that he could make different choices, and that the story could go in a completely different direction. It's that old dilemma of the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man. And this raises questions for our lives. Thankfully, Joseph does get it. And he says this to his brothers.
But God sent me ahead of you, to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God.
So all along, it's been God's will that Joseph be taken down to Egypt. But couldn't there have been an easier way for Joseph to get to Egypt and impress Pharaoh? Why all the hardships? Well, the clue is in how the story begins.
Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives.
Now, when the Bible mentions someone's age, it's usually about when a king begins to reign or when someone important dies. But in this case, it's to let us know that Joseph is a teenager. And as we're going to see, a spoilt teenager. He has amazing dreams about the future, but in his immaturity, he misunderstands them. He thinks it's all about his own greatness and how superior he is to his family. He doesn't realize it's about God's purposes and God's glory. And so God has to teach him a few lessons so that he will grasp the big picture. We're all familiar with the statement, history repeats itself. And it happens to be true. History does repeat itself, either in a positive or a negative way. This is not because of karma, but simply because we pass on our experiences, our memories, and unfortunately also our prejudices to succeeding generations. The only way to break the cycle is to confront our history and seek to undo its destructive effects. The story of Joseph and his brothers is about broken relationships within a family. But of course, the story of Joseph and his brothers doesn't begin with Joseph and his brothers. It begins with their father, Jacob. And Jacob's story begins with his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. If you recall, Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys, Jacob and Esau. If they'd lived today, Esau would have played rugby and Jacob would have played chess. Because this is what we learn of family life in that happy household.
The boys grew up and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
This blatant favoritism of one child over another nearly destroyed that family. And as a result, Jacob had to go through many hardships, but God brought him through them all. But Jacob's life will never be peaceful. Why not? Because history is repeating itself. There's conflict in his family. He can't see that the single greatest cause of the conflict in his family is him. He takes no pains to hide the fact that he favors Joseph over his other sons, just as his father Isaac had favored Esau over him. You'd think that Jacob would have learned his lesson from his own experience. Let's go to Genesis 37, verse 3.
Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him.
Well, let's stop right there and look at this famous technicolor dream coat. In Hebrew, it's called a ketonet pasim. So what type of coat was it? What is the meaning of the word pasim? Oh, we're given a broad hint in 2 Samuel 13, verse 18, which describes the clothing of the daughters of a king. And she, Tamar, David's daughter, had a long-sleeved robe, in Hebrew, ketonet pasim. She had this robe upon her, for with such robes were the king's virgin daughters apparelled. Listen now to David Guzik's commentary on that verse. The idea behind the Hebrew phrase is that it was a robe extending all the way down to the wrists and ankles, as opposed to a shorter one. It was a garment of privilege and status, showing the person did not have to work much. And just to confirm that, a 19th century Italian rabbi known as Shadal, which is an acronym for Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto, comments, "The length of the coat is a sign of stature and liberty. It signifies Joseph's freedom from any labor, it not being practical to work in such long attire." Small wonder it would prove to be a cause of envy to Joseph's brothers. Now, I sounded as if I'm making light of this garment, but it was no doubt precious to both Jacob and Joseph. However, from a spiritual point of view, it was a garment that Joseph would have to grow into.
When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of corn out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said.
Now, just in case you didn't get it, they hated him. At the heart of the family dynamics is the fact that the 12 brothers had the same father, but different mothers. We're not told so in this particular passage, but the reason Jacob loves Joseph more than the others is because Joseph is the son of his beloved Rachel, and also because Joseph was a laat lammetjie, which is Afrikaans for a child of his old age. Also, listen to how Joseph is described in Genesis 39, verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. In Hebrew, Yefer To'ar v'Yefer Mar'eh. These are the exact same Hebrew words used in Genesis 29:17 to describe his mother Rachel. Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance, and the Hebrew is in the feminine form, Yefat To'ar v'Yefat Mar'eh. In other words, Joseph inherited her looks, which tells us that each time Jacob looked at Joseph, he could see his beloved Rachel. So we have this sharp contrast between how much Jacob loves Joseph and how much his brothers hate him. They hate him firstly because he's his father's favorite, and secondly because of his boastful dreams, in which he's the chief sheaf. But there's a third reason, and for that we have to go back to Genesis 37, verse 2. Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Joseph is a tattletale, but he's even worse than a tattletale. Notice, it doesn't say the brothers were bad, it says the reports were bad. The Hebrew word used here is dibah, and there's no way to sugarcoat this, but it means telling something not altogether true about someone. The word dibah appears in only one other place in the Torah. Now, when a word is used only rarely in the Bible, it's like a flashing beacon, and God wants us to make the connections. The only other place where this word dibah occurs in the Torah is in the episode of the spies scouting out the land of Canaan. Moses sent them to check it out so they could devise a strategy for its conquest. But what happens instead? Numbers 13 verse 32, they brought to the people of Israel an evil report of the land that they had spied out. Bad report, evil report. In Hebrew, it's that same word, dibah. The 10 spies were in effect telling the people, God has been lying to us. They were slandering God. So the use of the word deba strongly suggests that Joseph was slandering his 10 brothers. I know it's difficult to believe about the saintly Joseph, but aren't you glad the Bible shows us people, warts and all? There's hope for us. But what's really bad is that it seems Jacob encourages this behavior. Well, he wasn't doing young Joe any favors. Came the day Joseph's brothers were away minding the sheep, so Jacob sent Joseph to see if all was well with them. It seems as if Jacob is oblivious to the conflict he's created in his family. He's now setting up a situation with all the potential for disaster. Genesis 37:18-20. They saw him from afar. Well, in that multicolored robe, he must have stuck out like a sore thumb. You wonder if he ever took it off. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." They reckon that if they can kill the dreamer, they will kill his dreams, dreams in which they have to bow down to him. Destroy him, and God's prophecies won't come to pass. I think it's the same today. Destroy Israel, and God's prophecies won't come to pass. Are Israel's enemies in for a surprise? But this is how the Torah describes the brothers' attack on Joseph. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his coat, the long-sleeved coat that was on him, and took him and cast him into a pit. Notice the emphasis. It doesn't just say they stripped Joseph of his coat, but they stripped Joseph of his coat, the long-sleeved coat that was on him. The long sleeves that made him think he didn't have to muck in along with his brothers. So the first thing the brothers do is rip off the one thing that more than anything else symbolizes the special status Joseph enjoyed. Perhaps more prophetically, they strip off the sign of the father's favor. They then throw him into a pit and afterwards sell him into slavery. So in a single day, Joseph goes from being the preferred son with special privileges to being a powerless slave, bottom of the scrap heap. So we see that the relationship between Joseph and his brothers has broken down completely, and it would seem irretrievably. The only light in all of this is that the oldest son, Reuben, wants to save Joseph. But while Reuben's back is turned, Judah sees an opportunity to make some money out of Joseph, and he convinces the others to sell him into slavery. Notice that the two key players are Reuben and Judah, and this fact is going to resurface much later, but for now, history is about to repeat itself. Just as Isaac was deceived by his son Jacob, so Jacob will be deceived by his sons. They lie to him and tell him that Joseph was killed by a wild animal, and part of the deception is that they've dipped the coat in animal blood and presented it as evidence to Jacob. Consider this. They lived out this lie every day for the next 22 years, day in and day out, year in and year out they watched their elderly father mourn for Joseph, and they never said a word. You have to ask yourself, who did they hate more, their brother or their father? I'm sure you remember what happens next. Joseph was sold to an Egyptian official named Potiphar. Mrs. Potiphar falsely accuses him of rape, and he ends up in an Egyptian prison. It's ironic. Joseph had falsely accused his brothers, and now he's falsely accused himself. History is repeating itself. But God intervenes, and Joseph goes from the prison to the palace. Well, I'm not going to rehash the story. You're probably familiar with it anyway. Joseph comes to Pharaoh's attention when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams of a famine that's going to last 7 years, and it's coming in 7 years' time. Long story short, Joseph is made prime minister of Egypt. 7 years later, the scene shifts back to Canaan, where Jacob is speaking to his sons.
When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him.
Benjamin is also a son of Rachel, but more of that later. 2 decades earlier, Jacob had sent Joseph to his 10 brothers. Now, unknowingly, Jacob sends the same 10 brothers to Joseph. The first time had been with disastrous results from a human point of view, but this time the balance of power has shifted. Will the result again be disastrous? Remember, no one can buy grain without Joseph's permission. Genesis 42, verse 7. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger towards them and spoke harshly to them. Verse 8. Now Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. He recalled his dreams that he had dreamed about them, and he said, "You are spies. You have come to see the land in its nakedness." Obviously, it was the sight of his brothers bowing before him that made him recall the dreams of his youth. But instead of a big family reunion, a group hug, Joseph begins to subject his brothers to what can only be termed mental and emotional torture. And as we'll see next week, not only them, but their father as well. Why does he do it? Is he getting his revenge, or does he have a plan? Think about it. Who was his great-grandfather? Abraham. His grandfather, Isaac. So don't you think that even as a small child, he must have been told about the promises God had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's in Genesis 12, verse 3. So Joseph knows that he and his family are part of God's plan for fixing a broken world. The whole family has a great destiny, but it also has a terrible past. Their calling is to become one people under God's rule and to be a light to the nations. But God knows that a family that's so divided has no hope of becoming one nation under his rule. And Joseph knows it too. On the surface, it seems as if there can never be healing, because not even God himself can force Jacob to love his sons equally. Jacob himself is incapable. The only solution that the brothers are going to have to come to is the place of accepting their father's favoritism and of confronting their own feelings towards the sons of Rachel. But it's not just about coming to terms with their father's choices, it's about coming to terms with God's choice. We're told Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Well, there's a whole lot more to that statement than mere physical recognition. They have to recognize that God has chosen Joseph for a specific role and let go of their envy. And just as an aside here, when I try to tell Christians that God still has a plan for Israel, some of them say to me, "What has that got to do with salvation?" For many Christians, it's all about being saved, healed, and delivered. Wonderful as that is, it puts the focus on us and not on God's kingdom. That's why we're so fragmented and divided. We don't see the big picture. Don't get me wrong, we must preach the gospel, but it's the gospel of the kingdom, not just the gospel of us. We need to be like Joseph. We need to see the big picture. And Israel is part of that picture. And by the same token, Israel needs to come to terms with the fact that God is not the God of the Jews only. He's chosen people out of every nation to serve him, to be part of his bride. But getting back to Joseph, if the brothers don't come to terms with these issues, history will continue to repeat itself. Next week, however, we're going to see history recreated and history reversed.